I'll just go ahead and get started then as well. I'm Kara Sarah with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and I'm joined by CJ Reynolds, also of the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. And so we just posted a document in the chat that is going to be how CJ is going to take notes, but also if you want to open it up and take notes alongside us, you're welcome to do that. As a housekeeping item, this meeting is being recorded. If you want to talk, feel free to unmute yourselves and let us know feedback or interrupt us. Also feel free to put stuff in the chat. But if you are not actively talking, please remember to mute yourself so that we don't have background noise. So just an overview of what we're going to go through today, just the welcome, which we're in now, summary of last month's meeting of the MPC. Then we're going to do an overview of the document, what's included in each of the chapters and that structure. Then we'll do chapters 1 and 2 to review the layout and the draft goals there, and take a break at 2 o'clock. Then we'll come back after 10 minutes and do the same thing for chapters 3, 4, and 5, just looking at the layout and the draft goals. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So as an update or recap for those who were not able to attend the September meeting, that was a meeting of the MPC, which is a group of staff from city and county governments that are member governments in the Resiliency Coalition. And in that meeting, we reviewed the draft chapter titles, and we set some priorities of what might go in those draft chapters. And a lot of that priority setting was in consideration of what came out of the summit second day breakout discussions and the priorities that we saw there. So trying to take those priorities and categorize them into chapters and then figure out what the highest priority topics were in each of those chapters. So our goals for this meeting are to, again, review the chapter structure. We'll discuss climate stressors as a way of organizing the sort of natural hazards and the why we're doing the plan. And then we'll also be reviewing draft goals for each of the chapters. And then finally talking about the chapter workshops, at least for the next, or for the first 2 chapters, as well as what we need to prioritize for the workshops in general.
So one of the things I wanted to reflect on, Kara, before you go into this one, is that I know many of you have advanced vulnerability assessments. You're in the different stages of developing resilience and sustainability plans for yourselves. And one of the things we're hoping to be able to capture today while we're looking at these chapters is for you to also help us understand what you're working on, what are some of your priorities, and or things you feel that the region should have as a priority in order to help you have those priorities in your own plans down the road. So it's kind of a, beyond what you're going to see on the screen, which is really our first draft at capturing some of those big goals and ideas that Kara mentioned have been discussed, is really to hear from you about what's really important and what you think is going to be important, and also to reflect on maybe some of the concerns. This is not a chapter development workshop. Those will come. We will have 5 workshops, 1 workshop per chapter as we go through this. This is to help Kara and I really figure out how to best structure and plan for those chapter workshops, figure out who should be in facilitating and presenting and helping us bring content in there. And that's where we'll do a lot of the visioning, the detailed facilitated discussions, the breakout groups, and the actual writing and reacting and responding and hoovering up of some of the best ideas. But this is to figure out what have we missed, what do we need to think about, and it's sort of a high level advisory capacity. So you're going to see things that you're like, there's no objective here, but there's goals and actions. This is because these were ideas that we were capturing and we wanted to throw them onto our electronic boards to help get some ideas. So there is structure. Kara has helped us organize the structure, and I'll turn it back over to you. I just wanted to add that context.
Okay. So here's just an overview of what's in each chapter. Each chapter has an introduction, and chapters 3 through 5 have vision statements. So for chapters 1 and 2, the introduction is kind of serving as an overview of what's in the chapter and sort of why the chapter is in the plan and how it relates to the other chapters. And then in chapters 3 through 5, which are the people, place, prosperity, that came out of the last meetings, and it's generally, well, we can talk more about what's in those chapters, but the vision statements are sort of to guide the goals that are going to be at the end of the chapter. So the goals are sort of related to what we envision resilient people, resilient places, and resilient prosperity, or a resilient economy to look like. So then we have an impact section in each of the chapters. In chapters 1, that's generally how natural hazards are going to be worsened by climate stressors. And then chapter 2, how the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that already exist are going to be worsened by climate stressors or natural hazards as they're worsened by climate stressors. In chapters 3 through 5 are the impacts related to public health, habitats and ecosystems, infrastructure, affordable housing, and economy. And as always, we're looking for feedback on this. It's not set in stone. And then that follows with an objectives and goals section, and finally a scorecard. It's possible that in the workshop we decide that the scorecard is something that would be developed in the future, and so the goal, or one of the goals in that chapter, would be to develop a scorecard. So chapter 1, generally the structure is, again, the introduction, an identification of hazards, and then how the hazards are impacted by climate stressors, planning, goals and objectives, as we've stated previously, and the scorecard, which might be developed or might be a goal to develop in section 3. So previously we had decided to align the hazards with the statewide hazard mitigation plan, or that was a recommendation. As always, open to further recommendations. With some additional feedback, we found that the climate stressors as identified in the National Climate Assessment were a better, made more sense as a way to organize the worsening conditions and how they're impacting the natural hazards that we have identified in the statewide hazard mitigation plan. So combining and reviewing the National Climate Assessment alongside the CSAP recommendations, the TBEPS Climate Vulnerability Assessment, and then additional literature where we need to fill in any gaps. The climate stressors that we would list in the plan are on the right: sea level rise, increased air temperatures, increased water temperatures, extended frost season, storminess, and drought and ocean acidification. And again, that comes from Tampa Bay Estuary Program's review of the National Climate Assessment and what of those hazards are most relevant to the Tampa Bay area. And so that we can continue to plan for local mitigation strategies and be consistent with emergency management, we would connect those climate stressors with the natural hazards that are identified in the statewide hazard mitigation plan. So here you can see flooding would be worsened by sea level rise, increased air temperature and water temperature, and storminess. And this is something that we can review further in the workshop if these aren't aligned as closely as you'd like to see them aligned. So I did want to see on the left, those are the natural hazards that are most relevant to the Tampa Bay region and most likely to be worsened by climate change. I don't know if anyone sees something that they think is missing here.
Where would HABs fall in this rubric?
I'm sorry.
Harmful algal blooms. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
I believe that's an outcome of a climate stressor from the increased water temperatures. Did I get that right? Yeah.
And the
Yes,
extreme
Kara.
rainfall.
Okay.
Kara, this is Rob Brown. Since these were, again, guided by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, we were looking primarily most of the ecological effects, but we don't have the human effects here. We don't have the increased pests on crops, disease, pandemics, air quality, vector-borne diseases. I don't know where they fit. And harmful algal bloom could be in with that as well.
So Rob, you're saying we need to add man-made human hazards or stressors?
Well, yeah, if you look at the report, there's a whole section on human health that we've totally ignored here.
Okay.
I would just say that like the vector increase in vector-borne disease is tied to the increase in temperature and the increased rainfall potentially too, with some of like the mosquito borne illnesses and things like that. I think it's, I don't think we're missing that right now. It's just a matter of crosswalking them further to some of these other impacts like you're talking about for human health or for agricultural services.
But if you're using these as key parameters, again, we're yeah, they're all interrelated. They're, none of them are mutually exclusive. But to put in human health down as a, because of increased temperature, no, it needs to be brought to the surface as one of the main issues we have to be looking at.
So one of the chapters, Rob, is going to be looking at people. And so the idea is, what climate stressors would we look at in terms of the impact on people-centric concerns like human health? That's one of the key chapters that I think Kara went over.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that because we're trying to figure out how to best organize the risks and hazards and where we put these all. And I've been recommending that we have one place that's a summary component, and then it expands out where we have additional components that are specific to people or specific to place. But there's a lot of, this is the great opportunity. There's a lot of interconnected things that also will have, we're identifying how this crosses over to this goal in this chapter, etc. So I've got a note on here to add factors that are related to man-made hazards and stressors from pandemics, biological incidents, vectors, all good stuff. Okay, anything else? And Jean has mentioned a note to include and use examples of lifelines, and Hank has also brought up HABs regarding a thing. So I'll add HABs as a consideration and we'll figure out where it best fits.
Rob, what if I added a third column on the right that connected how the natural hazard impacted people, and then we can also have infrastructure and the other sort of assets that we want to talk about impacts for, just so that people in this chapter know that it's coming later on?
Again, I just wanted to make sure that public health is not just a subset or buried somewhere in there. I mean, it needs to be brought out front how these things are affecting public health. Air quality itself, because of increased temperature and everything else, ultimately, it kind of all affects public health in some form or fashion. So if you guys want to, have a separate section on just public health and how all these things interrelate, that's fine. I just don't want to get, at this point in time, I just didn't want to get it buried somewhere.
Thank
This
you.
is Gene. I like what CJ, what you mentioned about showing something a little inclusive of all the various parameters that we talked about with the University of South Florida, with the the development of the community vulnerability study for the county, because that's a whole area that's going to affect not only the economy, but it's going to affect people and how they respond and live, and our quality of life, and how we're going to even redevelop or respond to disasters. So I like having, Kara, I thought that was a good idea, is have some sort of trigger in that table, just something abbreviated even, so they know that there's a chapter that's more comprehensive coming. So, and that's the only thing. I agree with Rob. It's sort of missing from here, so you don't even know that it's coming in the report. So, I mean, This is a really good table. So just putting something in there, flagging it, I think would help a lot.
Right. No, thank you. And so just so you guys know, before we get into these chapters, there will be an executive summary of the document. So that overarching, what are we looking at? What are the goals? What are the components? So then they'll get into the details. And then one other thing I wanted to mention was that we want this to be very accessible to both the community, business leaders, elected officials, so that we'll be balancing how much technical detail and information is actually in the plan itself, but we expect will require a big honkin' appendix at the end to put in any of the key justification. We'll have references to citing the existing documents that have been produced with supportive science. So that'll all be a part of it as well. So I have the role of sort of timekeeping here, so I want to move us on into the next one. If you feel like you need to say something, post it in the chat. We will be sure that it gets into the next, into my notes, and we're saving all of this as well.
So for this chapter, and I guess we've kind of talked about it a little bit already now, the impacts, and maybe impacts is the wrong word and we can workshop that, but it's the interaction between the climate stressors and the natural hazards and how those are creating worsening future conditions. So it's sea level rise plus the tropical cyclone or hurricane, tropical storm as identified in the statewide hazard mitigation plan, and how that's going to be worse in the future. So that's the extent that I'm proposing this chapter right now. I'm open to feedback there. And then you can see in the note in the bottom left, the impacts of those worsened natural hazards would be in the chapters following. So health, the environment, infrastructure, and the economy. Those impacts would be in the chapter where we're setting goals for those assets. So that it's closer to the goals, and when someone's reading the actual goal section, they're understanding why we're having certain goals, because we're acknowledging how it's impacted in that same chapter. Okay, so these are the goals so far for this first chapter. The first goal is to identify, define additional data or research needed by local governments. And then the second goal is to develop regional consistency on how climate change is analyzed in mitigation plans.
These are general goals. Obviously, there's a lot more behind that we would work on in the workshops to specifically tease out what other aspects do we need to understand, and that would lead to either locally specific data and research needs, or regional collaboration to obtain data sets, better modeling, better integration of multiple compound hazards on different assets and humans. So this is what we see as goals, but not the definitive goals. Any other thoughts on what the scorecards might look like, or you want to? We'll just move on from there. I think, Kara, that's probably if folks think of things. And so as we go through today in the next hour and a half or so, just feel free to dump it into the chat, even if it relates to a previous chapter. But if it relates to another chapter, just put a note, chapter 3, boom, and then we'll be able to collect it and integrate it. So we're like going, wait, okay. Susan's got a point. Rob's point about the importance of public health, climate change, and daily lives, mosquitoes, and all kinds of aspects of that. So this comes under consideration perhaps of community engagement thought processes. So thanks, Susan, for sharing. All right. Anyone else left on this chapter? Ideas, components? One of the important things we'll want to tap into is your recommendations on any and your collection of existing vulnerability and research and information, because we'll be wanting to present sort of a state of the region on the climate vulnerability hazard related data. So I'm envisioning many of the counties have conducted different research and that we'll want to pick out, you know, and have presentations so we can see, for example, the tidal vulnerability study, other components, etc. So Allison asking, any examples of scorecards from other areas in the countries we can use? Yes, certainly, and we'll pluck some of those out. Good, yes, Maryland has good scorecards for their Bay. So lots of good things coming out of this one. All right.
Rachel's asking, are we going to do adaptation? Are we going to look at adaptation plans in addition to mitigation plans? If that's in reference to the goals and the actions, there will be adaptation and mitigation actions. The challenge is just finding stuff that we can all agree to. And then most likely the goals will have actions underneath them. So these are just really general goals. But once we have actions underneath all of the goals, we'll also hopefully have tiered actions. So local governments that have a lot of political will and maybe a lot of financial ability can try to do all of the actions under the goals or get to the top tier in the actions, however we choose to organize that. And then local governments that maybe have less political will or less funding can get to like tier 1 in the actions, and that can make that their goal point. Jennifer
So
has
some
a
of these
suggested goal: uniform messaging, communication of science impacts solutions across the region.
Okay. That's probably a good topic for one of the other chapters, but an excellent point.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, then one more.
Jean has a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Noticed working with communities across the Bay, plans and policies are unique and don't seem to relate back to the region. May be good to incorporate a matrix to identify relationships between communities and identify how respective communities are working together. I think, Jean, that's the idea of the scorecard, is really that, so we can all cross, you know, once everyone decides on what is, you know, a set of goals and objectives, this will really help to identify how we can compare to each other. That peer exchange will be great. Okay, so chapter 2, this one is where we really focus in on the humans, and we love that you guys all were dialed in on that from the first chapter, because it is a major part of it. So a lot of work has been started in different levels, essentially what Jean was saying. A lot of work has been done to start to assess community vulnerability. The component that we see the importance of the regional action plan addressing this is to really raise the sort of attention onto this component, because we haven't done it in a collective way yet. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I know a number of you are working on community vulnerability from different aspects. So the thought we had here was section 1 was really to say, you know, go through the demographics, sort of the geographic and housing components. Section 2, look at the compound impacts and confluences of what's going on with who we are, where we live, and what we're living in. And then section 3 is going through a series of different goals and objectives to better inform what we still need to know and understand, And as noted in here, we really are more focused on the data needs and planning integration. Some of the mitigation goals where we say, well, we should do this better with our housings, or, you know, if we say heat is an issue and we need more access to green space, that should be addressed in the place chapter. So this is, again, similar to chapter 1, setting up the current conditions from the human perspective, layering in the current extreme weather and environmental risks in terms of beginning to really say, what do we know about vulnerability and from a people and neighborhood perspective. So we'll go through this more. Next screen, please. So a lot of this work is what some of the things that we're getting into, building on the Hillsborough County vulnerability assessment, our community vulnerability study, our collaboration with USF on the REACH project, which many of you have heard us talk about. But we're really saying we need to take stock, talk about who we are as a region, and we're thinking to do a county sort of region summary of population, demographics, perhaps using American Community Survey and the ALICE data. Also, yesterday it was brought up that we should really look at public health components out of like the CDC American Behavioral Survey, as well as the CDC SOVI. Of course, we just happen to forget that. And so really it's about highlighting the different aspects of social vulnerability, the different aspects of community risk that already exist before we even begin to layer on, you know, disaster planning, recovery, and resiliency. The other piece of this is a sort of telling the story about how, you know, and giving recognition to the different geographic vulnerabilities that exist in terms of community culture, as well as how that intersects with potential climate and adaptation. So, you know, what's different about Northern Pasco or Citrus and Hernando compared to, you know, downtown Tampa or Bradenton or something, right? And so we'll be looking to help showcase this and reflect and ensure that it's really an inclusive plan. It's not just this one corner of this one county kind of a thing. And then what we live in, which is, you know, like who, what, where is kind of, they're really looking at some of the aspects of the categories of homes, how we're beginning to evaluate what do we know about homes across a range of affordability, honing in on particular risk factors in terms of either locations, geographic, age, building design. There'll be some aspects referencing changes in, you know, funding mechanisms and market affordability. So it's a bigger story than just purely what's at risk to impacts to climate, but also we'll look at how building design and then the importance of health and public health and heat. Heat as a hazard previously defined will get reintroduced and woven in this chapter. So next screen. And so this is where we like weave it all together, talk about these climate components, the socioeconomic vulnerability, and really looking at some of the additional risk factors, or let's call them, they're stressors. I wouldn't call them climate stressors, but for example, the chronic underfunding of housing because of the way that the state uses the Housing Trust Fund, which is reducing what you as a city and county have available to build. So there may be questions. This is where the regional advocacy for certain kinds of attention to making our communities more resilient through resilient redevelopment that also offers a range of options of affordability. This is where we start to say this is all fits together, right? And then sort of spelling out the components of what we know about disaster recovery challenges that we still haven't yet addressed. In fact, I know some of you will be on or have recently done your post-disaster recovery plan and updates to your comp plans in peril of flood. So we'll weave this in so that that can reference those documents as well. Next screen. So again, this was just sort of, you know, like where could we possibly imagine we could go with the goals related to this chapter? You know, one, we can say, you know, a high level visioning kind of thing needs to happen in the workshop. And by the way, the workshop for this, we're looking at November 5. So that is the 95% official date. November 5th, to do a lot of this sort of where are we, our visioning, our concerns, and then get into some real goals and development. But these are things that, based on the work that we're already doing through REACH, you know we need additional data to look at some of these strategies and connecting to incomes and wages, developing a regional framework for what we just talked about previously, was really saying what is community vulnerability, how are we define it, what is also the opportunity, and what does that look like. There's a lot of, also we didn't mention it earlier, but we're working to incorporate equity issues and risks into this chapter and all of the other chapters. So there won't be just like a standalone equity, but we'll be looking at how the recommendations that we create can address certain existing components of inequity, and then recommendations to fix certain things. So there's a list of goals here, like support collaboration and integration between the LMS, the CRS programs, housing plans. So this is sort of what we call the crosswalk to really understand the holistic perspective of community vulnerability. So this is very focused on housing, because that's what I've been focusing on for the last month and a half. So we wanted to not exclude public health. We had several public health people on the call yesterday. They were like, hey, this is where people, the public health piece fits into where we live and other components of that. So this was just a quick sort of summary of chapter 2. So now we wanted to really hear about how you are thinking about community vulnerability and some big topics that you feel should be addressed and some of the priorities. You know, is there a specific population group that you're particularly interested in? Are there crossovers to resilient transportation? Allison, since you're here, I'm going to bring that up. That was also a conversation that came up yesterday, was access to transit as an issue related to community vulnerability. So I'm just going to pause, sit in silent, and wait for all of the great ideas and recommendations you have. So what, Hillsborough, you're quite advanced with your community vulnerability study. What are you seeing regarding some of the future challenges or future opportunities? If I can throw you on the spot here.
I was hoping Jean would start speaking there. This is Kevin Moran.
Hey, Kevin.
I'm not, can you ask me the question again? Because I'm looking at these goals and then trying to see.
Yeah,
so we know that we have okay, for example, we have a housing stock that is in places that don't need to evacuate. But then the concern is, are they so old that they don't meet any standards at all? So do we need to have a goal to bring existing homes up to some standard to make them resilient to storms? And
that's
I don't see anything about redevelopment or improving the existing housing stock.
These are, this is good. So the question becomes, there's aspects of mitigation opportunities for preserving existing stock, and that's a big recommendation for affordable housing. But when should you preserve under what goals, or like you said, a sort of a standard, right? Or common perspective. I think this is one of the greatest challenges in terms of equity, Kevin, so we're like, all right, how long do we keep investing in these houses where they're at, right? Or do we figure out an upland plan and new development? There's a lot of things on that. So thanks for bringing that up. Gene stepped away, by the way, so that's why he's not going to talk.
Yeah, I saw a note from Susan. Thank you. But the others are, so I appreciate these, but I don't know, like goal 1, where yes, we'll talk about housing in our resiliency documents, but how? Like, is it, what is the outcome of these things? What does that goal really look like when you include, if you include housing in a transportation resiliency document? I don't know what you've done. I don't know how effective that is. And I thought of that when I read the first one, and then And then goal 5, hopefully we're already doing that. We certainly are working hard to include things like housing plans in our local mitigation strategy. So I hope that goal 5 is more of a continue to do those, not new.
Mm.
And maybe it is because we're so advanced.
No, this is good. So the issue of language needs to be able to recognize work that has been done and is currently underway. And then perhaps, and that's what Kara mentioned before, is set steps so we can better define what that actually looks like and mean. And maybe there's some specific goals that where somebody is like, start by doing blah, or, you know, different things. So when we look at community vulnerability more broadly, and thinking about either disasters and risk. Oh, thank you, Jeff. I just see it. He brought up a point about looking at housing resilience through an equity and environmental justice lens is a good goal. We're trying to incorporate this more into our planning in Sarasota. So Rachel, you say it needs to incorporate more social vulnerability in addition to community vulnerability. What would that look like? Because we're intending to start with the social demographics, racial, household composition, income composition, and the play of that. What's your thought about incorporate more social vulnerability?
I missed that first part, so that actually, you answered my question. I had to step away real quick, so I didn't.
Oh, okay, good.
That,
I'm glad.
no, that helps. Like, thank you.
you're welcome. So Chris, Mr. Zambito, should these goals parallel or build from comprehensive plan elements? Why, I would ask you that question, and what do you think?
Well, I mean, in looking like at some of the comprehensive plans, you know, they have housing elements, they have transportation elements, they have infrastructure elements. I mean, should we try to have this, you know, kind of threaded into that same comprehensive concept, but, you know, just focus on the resilience overlap and climate stressor as they apply to those different elements? Because in theory, you know, these are comprehensive and cover all the big issues that the counties and cities want to look at. Does it make it more manageable in an approach if we kind of follow along with some of those existing tools that are out there?
Yeah, I think we had, that was one of our commitments, and that was to make sure that plan goals in here align with specific plan documents so that they can be better referenced, right? So that if this says, you know, do A, B, and C, and that's something that you all want to do when you do your comp plan update, then we've got this sort of cross-referencing between the regional thing and everyone's local thing. So
Chris, would that look like under this chapter, we would break the goals out under and say housing element, transportation element, or maybe like a key to the right of the goals that says this could go in your housing element, transportation element? Or maybe,
yeah, I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. If that's a framework that, you know, counties are already and cities are already using to approach, you know, some of these big picture items, you know, does it make sense to mimic that?
CJ, this is Sean College. I think that picking up on what Chris is saying, we got to ask ourselves, what is the voice of this document? Because, you know, this is, and I'm assuming, you know, I mean, I came to this as this is a regional plan, and the voice is meant to be, what can we do collectively as a region?
right.
But that would be different than talking about what locals are doing individually, or should be doing individually to some extent. I mean, and when I read what's on the screen now, 2 through 6, I think, can be or have a very regional voice, but I'm not sure about goal 1. I mean, are we when it says critical resilience documents and plans, are we talking about regional critical resilience documents and plans, and are there such regional documents and plans? I mean, maybe it's up for discussion, but I think this document might be best received if it focuses on what can we do regionally, collectively, and be in that voice than talking about what local government should be doing individually.
So let me finish my note here. Thank you for reflecting on that. This is the crux of what is the purpose of the plan, right? So you have raised the million-dollar question, is what do coalition members need the plan to say in order to strengthen and create internal awareness and momentum among either staff or elected officials? So we think of this as a 5-year strategic plan. And when we were together in January, not at the summit, but a follow-up meeting with the Management Planning Committee, there was a recommendation, I don't remember who brought it up, was that we create goals that local governments could take action on individually that were important, and that we also identify regional goals where we would all need to collaborate together to help achieve it. So let's say we pick one of these, housing goals, and it requires a boatload of GIS analysis and cross-mapping with public health. It may not be, you may say, we will integrate these things into our future housing element plans, our risk assessment for HUD plans, which helps create consistency locally, but that the counties and the RPCs and the housing thought leaders need to go get a grant to get the money, to get the funding, to get the modeling, to hire the consultants, right? So I think should be 2 levels, but again, I'd rather hear from, Sheridan and Hank and Jeff, and you guys say, are you expecting that there would be some guidance on what local governments are agreeing to do individually? Or do you want this all to be whatever we all do as a region? So is that helpful?
I think I'm not saying that local governments can't take and integrate some of this locally, but I'm saying that the voice of it, like goal 1 would be, the voice should be, as a region, we should be encouraging and supporting our local governments to integrate resiliency into all housing. The voice is not speaking as a local government.
Got it. I completely understand what you're saying now. Thank you.
Jennifer Schaefer has her hand raised.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this plan, community vulnerability, not just who we are and where we live, but what are our livelihoods? And you tell me what chapter this might fit in, or if it does at all. But I'm thinking about the vulnerability of our businesses, both large employers and small businesses, to climate stressors. I'm thinking of fishermen whose livelihoods might be threatened by ocean acidification and impacts to shellfish, or sea level rise impacting the land, the docks and the landings and the processing centers.
These are important topics, and we hope you can hang around for the prosperity chapter, which is chapter 5, because that's where we feel that putting attention to the climate impacts on key economic sectors, or the potential opportunities for developing economic growth with attention to emerging workforce things related to more climate change adaptation or something. So we'll address that in chapter 5, and as well aquaculture potentially fitting in that, to the extent that we have how to identify these goals and who needs to be a part of that. So Okay, so I understand the reflection of the voice piece of it to reflect the regional action and not what you were saying. So,
Hank's hand is raised.
nope, Hank.
Hey, I'm here, and sorry I'm a little informal. I am on vacation, but I had to
Aw,
in and hear this. I think overall, I think this stuff is great. I feel like some of these read more like actions to me or objectives. I think goal 3 should be like number 1. That we have a regional framework, and we look at metrics and evaluation, intersections between vulnerability and housing and affordable housing risks, and then some of the other goals actually kind of fit under that. I like the housing policy group to advocate for funding, but I feel like we should be going out after multiple sources of funding and not call out the Sadowski Trust Fund here as a
okay.
goal. And that, and if we decide to go in that direction, great, but, we can look at grants, we can look at different fundings at the, state and federal levels, and the Sadowski Trust Fund can be like a specific action, right? So let's string this out into these like SMART goals. And then I think goal 4, I understand about mapping housing inundation, but I think you're referring to flooding. I'm not sure or what type, like housing inundation is kind of, we need to define that a little bit better. But that's just a comment that I have about that. But I'll say that for Pinellas County, we talked about the correlation between what this plan should and can be and what we're doing. We're developing an affordable housing strategy right now, and that some of us are involved in, and it would be great to pull information and data and objectives and actions from this plan to say, look, not only are we trying to achieve certain objectives for residents within Pinellas County, but we're meeting set goals regionally that everyone's trying to work on collectively. So it makes our document more powerful. So that's a tie, from what we're doing to what this can be, and that they're just relatable. And this will go along like all sections of it, right? So not just housing, but mitigation for the hazards that we talked about earlier. So I just wanted to chime in with a couple of my thoughts there.
Hank, thanks for the synergy of looking at this. Thanks for cutting a couple hours out of your vacation.
No
that's dedication. You get the coalition member prize today. Thank you. Excellent comments on how to better organize these. And again, for those of you who might have just joined us, the community vulnerability, which will address a lot of this component of housing and the human component, is that workshop will be on November 5. So that's where we're really going to take this list of words and turn this into something that is really meaningful to the region, to the communities, to really help us look at this piece of it and how important housing is. Redevelopment is so important to our economy as well. I know from the University of Florida Schimberg Housing Center's coastal mapping tool that, and that's where goal number 4 was. It also came out of the great project we did with Manatee County for our peril of flood and their peril of flood, looking at, there's a lot of different ways to look at housing risk by age, by income, by area, by LMI. And there's some key documents that are required for your HUD CDBG or CDBG investments, which says create a risk assessment. So one of the goals and outcomes of this coming year or 2 would be to help create a standardized risk assessment document that would enable any city and county to do a really sort of straightforward approach, and we can cross compare. The big thing is that we don't know how fast we could potentially lose a lot of housing, right? So there's a lot of risk at stake here, either under extreme events as well as future inundation. And this is one of the biggest equity challenges of our time, is like, how do we manage redevelopment in a way that's going to be, so there's a lot more sort of want to call it social planning components that need to go into this thinking that we would try to figure out in our context of that. And also, how do we look at the necessary aspects of, if heat is going to be a factor, what are the ways that we think about housing in the future, so we don't just keep building the same old stuff that requires enormous energy resources or higher energy bills for those who can least afford it, right? So this is where, again, trying to be really innovative, action-oriented, think about what we would envision for a great neighborhood with resilient communities, housing options, across the spectrum. You know, we're always going to have like penthouses and, you know, $32 million places, but how do we build enough housing for the workforce that we need to attract to keep up with the growth, right? So that's the other piece of where it's not just all about negative resilience, but what's at stake and how do we support this? Because if we don't plan for it correctly, we're going to create other compound impacts. So any other comments?
Yeah, I'm seeing some
we have
people unmute.
Do we have anyone from the city of St. Pete on this call?
We do not.
Okay, I guess, yeah. We're recording this, yeah. So I'm just, I'm interested in their amendment or proposal for increasing density in the coastal high hazard zone. And I will say it just strikes me that there's a lot of risk in that zone. And I'm just curious, you know, I was thinking where I live is, you know, I'm pretty high and dry and just 2 blocks off Central Avenue by Grand Central. And it's just kind of, you know, they're adding the bus rapid transit to the Central Avenue corridor. I'm just kind of curious why they don't, like, why we haven't heard of increased possible condominiums along the Central Avenue corridor where there'll now be bus rapid transit and so on, and it's high and dry. And instead we're, you know, increasing the density. I know obviously it's very walkable and it would be very attractive to people in that way, but just wondering if cities have actually kind of, you know, as a county as well, economic development, you know, they talk about maybe looking at different areas that are more resilient for future development and businesses, but has it actually, is it only in conversation or is there any practice that's been done to do that? And, you know, maybe that would be in people's post-disaster redevelopment plans. I don't know if cities do those or if it's just a county that does.
Libby, you bring up a bunch of excellent points. The context of density and resiliency in the coastal high hazard area, I think does need to be addressed, discussed at least, let me just say that. I sat in on the City of St. Pete's ULI, that very workshop that they did to look at that. And I listened to the developers talk about what they were thinking about. And I understand some of what St. Pete is trying to do. So this is a question that has multiple levels of risk and time frame, right? And so it's an interesting one. They're sort of out there and there's things we could learn from them. So I'm going to make sure that we add that as a question to explore in the workshop, is the context of density, resiliency, and equity in coastal high hazard areas in building. Because I know
I think that was a recorded meeting that you could share. I'd be interested to watch.
It wasn't. It was little workshops. You had like an hour. There was 3 people. There was developers. I think they wrote reports on it. So there's, and
Okay.
then based on that, they developed some design guidelines. I think. Hank, does anything ring a bell? Sheridan, maybe.
Okay.
All right, but that was a good point. I'm sorry, I'm missing anybody else.
I think Hank had something.
Yeah, hey, CJ, and you know, Libby brings up a couple good points, and you know, going back to tying the local plans, I know goal 4 talks about, you know, new maps and science and data to support local planning, but I mean, maybe we could call out that you know, all, you know, counties, jurisdictions have, you know, unifying principles in their post-disaster redevelopment plan in relation to, you know, housing risk and development or something like that, right? One stool that I sit on a lot is, you know, how do we keep people in their homes? And so when we talk about housing, we talk about, you know, new development, redevelopment all the time, but we need to keep people in their homes. and if they should be there, and you know, with increased, you know, flooding risk and precipitation and heat in the future, you know, energy issues, you know, how do we make the existing aging housing infrastructure affordable and safe? And so I think that it'd be great to see that in here reflected in some way, you know, and just yeah. So we need to mitigate what's here as well, you know.
Got it. Thank you for crystallizing that. I think so. Sheridan bringing up a point about climate gentrification. So are you suggesting that we think about, reflect on understanding what that might look like, or how would you see that as a potential goal or an action or something?
Yeah, I mean, I just got to thinking about it, I think, from the previous comments that were made, but because I mean, I agree, I have the same concerns about increasing density in vulnerable areas. But then if we look to like redevelop areas that are just like high ground, and if those areas are historically where like certain populations have lived for generations, we wouldn't want to exile them from those areas, which I think we're already seeing in South Florida.
I do agree with that, and I'm part of the gentrification of my neighborhood. Yeah, but I blend in. I'm trying to, you know, improve the neighborhood. But anyway, we're doing. But yeah, that's part of why I kind of thought about the Central Avenue, because that's more kind of like between First Avenue and First Avenue North and South tends to be business areas. And you know, if we look, I think there's even this one place that I first noticed, it kind of has like a weird barn on top, but no one's buying it. It's on First Ave South because I think it's a brownfield, or it has something there that can't be dealt with. So yeah, I'd like to see them look to kind of like gray infrastructure that's in less use versus saying, hey, we need to come in and take over this whole neighborhood. But it's going to happen. It's the pressures.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just south of First Avenue, between First and 9th Avenue South, in that area is already very mixed and
right.
Heading
So
that way.
Gentrification is always happening. It's a question of what do we understand about climate, and how are we going to proactively plan to ensure that there's an inclusive component to it. So we promised to actually give you a break. So I wanted to say, if you have any less thoughts on community vulnerability, housing, neighborhood component, feel free to send them in a chat. We want to give you a 10-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to get into the people, place, and prosperity chapters. People, place, and prosperity, which will talk about the need for community engagement, empowerment, place being all the components that we should somehow think about, from green infrastructure to resilient neighborhoods and amenities, like in other discussions. And then prosperity is very much the connection between our current, businesses at risk and future risk and workforce components. So, all right, everyone, 10-minute break.
So this is the draft vision statement for the people section: resilient leadership through effective knowledge sharing, capacity building, and collaboration with community, business, and government. So we wanted to just take a moment to see if there were any initial reactions to the vision statement. Any feedback there?
So while you're thinking about this, where this comes from is me, the hoovering up about 10 different Rockefeller Resilient 100 city plans, and a great number of them in different ways have really identified the need for community education in the nonprofit or community organization, as well as the business organization, knowledge building and capacity building. So while we can develop our handy dandy models and rigorous maps and standards and structures, one of the crucial aspects of increasing resiliency is building the knowledge, building the ability to talk about these components. So the idea was to, power to the people at all levels, including government staff, elected officials, demonstrating leadership. So there was a great number of leadership strategies that were also recognized as being extremely important to embed within a plan. so that there is levels of accountability. So this is where it's about how we think about working together, what we need to do, what we need to know to work together on all aspects of resiliency. Maybe we should go on and then.
Sure. So again, the impacts are the interaction between the climate stressors and, in this case, local leadership. And then with an emphasis on the need for informed and activated communities, businesses, and governments. And this is the goals section. In this case, there are also actions underneath the goals. And I'm guessing the goal is probably a little hard to see, so I'm gonna read the goal, and then if you wanna, I'll pause for if anybody has feedback. So the first goal is to develop a culture which supports sustainability and resilience, innovation and action to increase community well-being and preparedness, focus on increasing community capacity goals that integrate well-being goals with resiliency, sustainability, and equity.
So Carrie didn't write that run-on sentence, I did. So the idea was there was a lot of things where, getting back to Sean, your idea of like, what's the big aspirational, how do we write in a language which, and maybe develop a culture isn't the right thing, but, you know, enhance or strengthen our cultures, which to support blah, blah, blah. So a lot of these key details have come out of like, how do we better engage? How do we build a network, reinforcing your networks are already there? How do we work with the existing networks? What do we need to do?
You're using the word networks like you're using community then?
Yeah, so within your, like, for example, your neighborhood associations that you already have, or your business, so is it within your stakeholder list, they themselves have their own networks, right?
Is he, like, for example, you have community capacity goals that integrate well-being goals with, so
right.
I don't think that needs to be, I think I know what you mean, but I don't know what you mean, so.
Yeah. Right, this is why we said, like, the essence of the exercise here is to say, like, okay, the well-being, how do we start to think about the keywords probably are really sustainability and resilience, innovation and action, right? So how can we better leverage? And I saw a chat from Chris or somebody previously who said this, you know, the plan still is sounding very government focused, right? And so we could overall strengthen the uptake of the plan by reflecting better on how organizations and business community leaders can be a part of this, right? And I think that's also an important goal. So that's what we're trying to start to say here.
Hey, CJ and Susan, I just wanted to, I don't know if I'm adding to it, but, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's sort of networks already, like you mentioned, the neighborhood associations. Some areas, I'm sure that's stronger than others, faith, you know, churches and service organizations. And so we started from day one with the Resiliency Coalition to have Resiliency Coalition partners. And if anyone says to you, or you're chatting with someone, they want to get involved, go onto the website and they should sign up. At least then we have that as an intake valve. And so, you know, how are we going to get this information out to the larger group of folks? Because it's one thing to do for governments to become more resilient. It's a far another thing for sort of, you know, everyday people out in the world. But so we're trying to find networks, and, you know, maybe we'll be pulling in things like media partners as this evolves a little bit. But anyway, it's really, really crucial. And I think that was an important point that was just raised about the distinction between what local governments do in their own right and how we connect to the community. And that's not an easy thing, but we start with the networks that are in place.
Right, and leveraging the, you know, so I don't have lists of, you know, St. Petersburg's neighborhood associations, right? CODA. So it's how do we work with you to support what your goals are to get into additional education, and who needs to be a part of this. So
And
the
CJ,
key is,
one more thing on that note. I just spent 2 hours on the Health and Equity Subcommittee or Committee of the East Central Florida Regional Resiliency Coalition, and it was just on health and just on equity, our 2-hour conversation. That's another layer that we must get to. I mean, we need to integrate it at all levels, but the depth of the conversation that we had today in East Central Florida, again, there wouldn't be time to do it right now, but I mean, it's they're dealing with food security and I mean, just really, into the weeds of people's lives. The digital divide was something we spent a lot of time talking about, especially with our new online world that we're all living in. So anyway, there's more layers to it, but this is a good start.
Yeah, no, there's the aspect of technology is a big one in that. Good comments. So the goal 2, which again, don't take the words per se specifically for that, but the idea is, thanks Hank, change it to Office of Management, but to budgeting, can certainly do that. There's 2 layers. One, the component is human resources and organizational development. It's a, decades old profession that is really, the aspect of, if it's not defined in the set of job descriptions and goals, if whatever your entity is trying to do isn't clearly articulated throughout the level of the organization and what people's actual jobs are, our perspective is, and this is drawn from the assessment I did with the Resilient 100 group that basically evaluated the successful cities that had been doing things, had embedded organizational management goals. So we might craft a set of those things based on things that you feel are important to help and support the initiatives you want to achieve. So that's the one idea of this, is both, where these things are policy-wise, leadership-wise, and, the community planning engagement pieces. So we can see a lot of conversations going in some different directions here to really build this out, but that's the essence of it. So let's go to the next page, I guess. And I want to cover place, because I'm sure you guys have a lot of perspectives on place, and then prosperity, and then get you out of here by 3 o'clock. So.
So same structure as the previous chapters. And here's the draft vision statement for place. Resilient critical infrastructure, protection of habitats and ecosystems from a changing climate, and the consideration of climate change as an obstacle to the necessary expansion of available affordable housing. And I organized the goals and the rest of the chapter into 2 scales, just really because the place chapter was so big and it had so much going into it, and then also to have a focus on neighborhoods. So the impacts here are the climate stressors as they relate to affordable housing, habitats and ecosystems, and critical infrastructure. And I'm just checking the chat.
Thank you, Allison, for sending us the link to the FHWA equity. That's great.
So Stephen says we might consider community lifelines instead of critical infrastructure.
Oh.
That's a good idea. Well,
yeah, what do you guys, so let's talk about that, Steve. Could you elaborate on why that might be an important language adjustment in the context of this document?
FEMA's really embraced it in all that they're doing in after storm impacts, but also in more whole community, holistic approaches. So it's it covers the same thing, but it gives a different perspective to it, more about the things you rely on as a lifeline rather than infrastructure, which sounds like bridges and such. So.
Got it. Well, I think that's a great idea. We can definitely, and several of our current projects are also looking at that aspect of resiliency in the community lifelines. So building on that will also help other components with planning.
Right.
So here are the goals, again, broken down into the 2 scales, neighborhood and community. Community, in this case, meaning the level of a city or a county. So a lot of the goals under neighborhood scale are related to affordable housing and affordable housing resiliency. And then under the community scale is where you would see a lot of the habitat related goals and the infrastructure related goals.
You guys have any perspectives on how we're trying to, again, make this approachable, relatable? Is this overly complicating? Is this not useful to how the context of your own plans? I mean, some of these things could be both. That's what when we realize that, you're like, we need the natural resources, and clean energy should also be a part of the neighborhood, or is it broader? So we don't need to split hairs, but we're trying to figure out how to, just give it some different ways of thinking about it.
Hank had something?
Yeah, sorry. So on the community scale goals, I understand the intent in that that's where we're incorporating the ecosystem and natural resources, but I feel like it's I guess maybe just lost a little bit in the title and the wording, the emphasis of the natural environment versus the built. And I'm not saying we like have to do it, but I'm wondering if it should be changed to like ecosystem scale goals, or maybe we call out ecosystem services once or twice in the goals itself, something like that. But I just feel like it's can be emphasized a little bit more in that section.
Thank you.
I think those goals are really important. Okay. Anyone else have any chats? Does wildlife include native plants? Plants and native wildlife? Were we missing some words?
Sorry, that's me. I'm just seeing goal 10. It says preserve the diversity, but it looks like it's mostly animal focused, which is absolutely essential. But I was wondering, like, is there reference to plants?
Like, is it included in wildlife?
Yeah.
Like flora and fauna is often stated.
Essentially.
Plants and animals, basically, like could be said instead of fish and wildlife. I'm wondering, like, I don't know, there's so much like adapt, but if the temperature of the water changes and it's no longer conducive to the seagrasses that grow there, we're not going to keep trying to plant the seagrasses that won't grow in the temperature the water is, so our habitats are going to shift, and I'm sure the Tampa Bay Estuary Program has a lot to say about this in their guidance and their plan. But it's, up until now, we've been working to get back to 1950s acreage goals, and we got there, but now it's like this what if that, the Tampa Bay TAC is really talking a lot about. But I guess it's like we want healthy habitats, but at some point, I think those might be, the habitats might be shifting in terms of what is dominant. Mangroves are already taking over salt marsh and so on. And so, yes, we would like to protect salt marsh, but are we going to have to look upriver maybe for some areas for salt marsh that are currently hardened to allow salt marsh to grow because the mangroves are going further up the rivers?
So I worked pretty hard with Kara and CJ to make sure that we took some of the goals that are already regionally adopted in the CCMP and the new Habitat Master Plan. We changed the whole paradigm largely based off of the effects that we're anticipating that you can attribute to climate change, whether that's sea level rise or changing temperatures or changing precipitation patterns. So I think that the region's already done that hard work in terms of setting attainable goals that are responding to changes in our climate. the sort of remaining questions that I think we have to answer together is, okay, so we think we have evidence-based goals for how to address that, but what is it exactly that we're going to do? What's the pathway to accomplish those goals? So, you know, are we going to be building more living shorelines to try and keep marshes, you know, at pace with changes in sea level rise and temperature that are benefiting things like mangroves? You know, answering those questions of what is it that we can do to make sure that we do reach our goals. And that's really what I hope this whole plan is, but we've definitely, I think, done already a lot of work with the regional goal setting around those topics.
Yeah, so, and I can see the actual actions coming through some of these things, Libby. Like, so the aspect of how is land use planning affecting the ability of the Bay to adapt, right? So what are commitments to waterfront restoration and conservation that would enable adaptation to blah, right? And so I see some built environment, blue-green strategies evolving to, or actions, whatever, to support some of these goals. That's the key of this workshop for this chapter. Needs to have experts who can sit and craft and reflect on what you brought up and then how this comes into a component. So
Hey,
Sean's been, Chad, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, just one quick add to that was just on sort of the other side of the equation of some of these adaptation opportunities are things like carbon sequestration and you know, wetlands restoration. So they're actually kind of positive. Do you understand? I want to make sure that we attend to that in the plan so we can think about, you know, those kinds of opportunities, be they be job creators or like if we're planting you know, trees or something, you know, we want to get the trees that have a bigger carbon uptake and that sort of thing. So
got it. I'm going to chat here for you. Susan says work on habitats and carbon benefits. Okay, so Sean, college air quality may not be the only reason to encourage the expansion of clean energy policies. Right. So the whole thing needs to be more strongly attentive to these aspects of mitigation. So let's, air quality, I guess, what do you feel about that? What's the weakness associated with it? So should we have other components? One of the things I'd like to ask you to all think about is that the memorandum of understanding doesn't explicitly say we should have a sustainability and resiliency plan. In my mind, sustainability takes the mitigation and on savings and conservation of air and water quality and all these things to a different level than just a resiliency thing. So I think we were, as staff, we were sort of doing a cautious baby step on how to begin to address what we perceive, what we recognize are the important aspects for reducing carbon emissions, okay? So I think most of all of you also recognize the importance of reducing carbon emissions. I don't know what level of support we have within our community. So I guess this is a point, you know, let's just have a little philosophical conversation before we go into the prosperity chapter about, you know, how far can we take? What's your perspective on how far we can go with integrated sustainability and resiliency? So I'm just going to ask, I know Hank, you're in the process of starting a plan. Hillsborough County has tremendous investments in solar and energy conservation, but doesn't call it out in some other ways that maybe are more obvious. So I'm going to stop talking and ask you guys, how should this plan reflect on carbon mitigation and sustainability?
Can you repeat the question, CJ?
Certainly.
I think I have someone to answer. Yeah.
I think many of us are aware and have concerns about carbon emissions and the fact that if we don't change some of our current ways of living and building and behaving, that we're going to continue to make this worse. So right now we have a plan that has a fairly heavy language on adaptation. resiliency and adaptation, which is admirable that we're focusing on, let's address this, let's protect certain things. But we haven't really talked about how do we improve and reduce. So the notion of what is the...
Okay, so just out of curiosity, like Charlie Crist is a politician, right? So he's on one side, but he currently has a plan. I have the note at home that was dropped in my mail, but I've talked with folks with the climate lobby about it before. And so their idea, it's a not a tax, but kind of like a carbon fee, something. So, do you want to put something in there? Like, about whether or not, I don't know, supporting legislation? Like, is that something?
No, not that level. I'm like, I don't think we're ready for that. I mean, I'm not a chicken shit, right? Y'all know that. But the idea is...
Right, yeah, and I don't know. I'm just throwing that, the idea that it's one party versus the other makes me think it's not appropriate, but...
Yeah, right, I'll be the chicken. This is Kevin Murray in Hillsborough County. Our board barely signed up to the Resiliency Coalition. And if we go down this path, I think we'd get less support. My board's different now, but that's not what they signed up for when they joined this, to go down.
So you think the focus on resilience and adaptation, Kevin, is where we should mostly stay?
Yes, that's what they signed up for us to work on, for me to work on. Not obviously y'all can do whatever, but they did not. They barely. It did not. I don't think it passed unanimously. So.
Yeah, that's good information.
So.
And then we talked about making a framework that certain communities can go further if they want, of course. And then, yeah.
And CJ recognized we're actually doing a lot of that stuff.
You are.
We're certainly not out front holding the banner on it in a way.
Right.
So we'd rather do it quietly than.
We could talk about looking at economic benefits possibly in certain ways.
Well,
can we discuss alternative energies that are currently being used already?
Well, so we've got an entree into, and I don't want to belabor this, but the point was a number of you are developing sustainability action plans. And so if there are low-hanging fruit goals that are important for sustainability, changing of internal programs, policies, we welcome the chance to have this integrated and discussed. I'm not talking about carbon policies, but for example, as we know, the region's largest carbon source is transportation. So, clean energy mass transit. So Brad Miller from Pinellas Suncoast Transportation Authority sat on the webinar yesterday and wanting to know where was this going to go and how would he be a part of it, and what could this plan do to help create the vision for local governments to do what he also sees as an important thing, right? So there's this part of energy that's related to emissions, which we can also address. So I wanted to bring it up, but it's not, so the whole point of it was that we just had that one little kind of half-baked goal about the air quality might not be the only reason to encourage the expansion of clean energy policies. The Clear Sky project that we have is our attempt to put the context of solar plus storage and a public safety perspective, right? What can we explore for that? What will it do for this? But that doesn't help us get down the road with clean energy transportation or reduction of energy savings in general. So we'll stick with resiliency for now for this conversation, and we'll let the rest of this thing evolve with commitments to improve sustainability when it makes sense in the context of resiliency. They work together, right? They're not completely dysfunctional or dysfunctional. Maybe they are. Okay. All right. Any other?
had a comment.
Hey.
Yeah, thanks. And Kevin, don't sell your work short, man. I'm like jealous of all the solar panels you guys got everywhere. The board is approving a lot of stuff, and we're trying to get to that place as a local governmental staff and organization. And luckily we have the Duke program, the solar program, to kind of jumpstart us. I would say that it is a slippery slope and a hard road to try to implement more of these sustainability minded, carbon tax, energy policies on a community, but there are actions that we could take as local governments and organizations that provide leadership and examples for others to follow, and then other local organizations that we can support that can then trickle, impact into the community. And I think that's a safe space for us to be in politically, and something that we're actively trying to do in certain ways. I would say a good point of integration for sustainability is the natural environment. When we talk about, preserving resources today for, future generations, land comes to mind, conservation, ecosystem services, and so that's a really safe space as far as, yeah, we need more green infrastructure to, let's say, mitigate risk, but at the same token, maybe preserving land that could become green infrastructure ensures sustainability of the community into the long run, right? And all the trickled impacts that come with that. You're not just mitigating risk, you're ensuring clean air, you're ensuring cool air, with increased heat, mental health, the works, right? So I think that's a place that maybe we all can play in together, a sandbox regionally that can fit well right here.
Yeah, I agree with that. Those are good points. Sustainability
CJ?
of natural spaces.
On Kevin and Hank's points, CJ, you've been really diligent about trying to pull out measures that are resilience that also help people use less energy. And so I think I don't think it's necessary to just say we're not going to do anything on clean energy because that's going to be political. I mean, we don't have to do that. Like you just pointed out, battery storages or microgrids are a really good example of resilience, kind of emergency management. I mean, there are pieces like that. But in Hillsborough, you guys are leaders. You offer the Solar Energy Loan Fund. I put that into the chat earlier. You have the solar co-ops going over there. You're doing a lot of your own good stuff. And I know, Hank referred to this in-house as well. So you're moving along. And I put it in the chat box that, I would like to see the coalition and the coalition partners, member governments, to begin to really track these costs. They do it down in Miami-Dade County because they're part of the Rockefeller Resilience. It's nothing more complicated than they tag expenses with a green leaf emoji. And in their 5-year capital plan, they've identified $23 billion with a B, and about $16.5 billion of that is actually sea level rise, very, very more direct costs. Some of it is more softer resiliency. And once you all start to track costs and your elected officials that may not be as far down the road on climate change will start to, because they did this in Norfolk, Virginia. And that's a super conservative place. And when people realized what it was costing them, they're like, oh, well, what do we do so we don't make it worse? And then that opens up the door to more of the greenhouse gas reduction piece of it as well. And the reason I said earlier about the carbon, if you can turn it into a positive and a way to either fund further restoration or, with the credits for the carbon reductions. So anyway, I think there's a way to continue down the road even without flying a flag. And, we don't need to have a greenhouse gas parade here, but there's a lot we can do.
Thank you. Good summary on that. We won't
Jennifer's hand is raised.
Okay, now we got to go into the next one. So.
Sure, just quickly, thank you. I'm on the call today as a community partner, not a coalition partner. I represent a nonprofit in the Sarasota-Manatee region, and for what it's worth and for the record, all of our participants are talking about sustainability, practicing sustainability, developing sustainability programs, and I can't speak for the city of Sarasota, or I understand our newest member, Sarasota County, but they do, but they do have very robust sustainability programs. They're doing all the sorts of things that are in fact mitigation, we just don't call it that. So we're in all the way.
Well, I'm sure then there's probably a lot we can learn from you guys, and we're really excited that you joined the call today. Thank you for that. And your expertise on communications and framing is really important as we go forward with the overall plan in general. So, and we need to transfer knowledge from county to county. That's one of the crux of this, and organization to organization. So how we think about that is going to be key. So we have one more chapter to go through. We want to get you out of here in like 15 to 16 minutes. Or if you want to stay on longer, but it is Friday afternoon, we respect your time. So Kara, you want to get us rolling on prosperity?
Sure. So same structure as the previous chapters with the vision statement in the front. And here we've actually started writing the introduction as well. So the introduction enhance the resilience of the regional economy to natural disasters and climate stressors through increased awareness of risks, costs, and benefits of preparation among businesses. And then the vision statement here is a little bit more of a rough draft as compared to the other ones. So it should include something about potential risks to current leading sectors such as tourism, cultural and historic preservation, and opportunities for services and technologies to support resilient adaptation, clean energy, and resilient redevelopment.
This one was a bit of a challenge because there was a lot of conversation about different aspects of our economy. And so we put them in here. And this one also, well, as you see when Kara goes through the next screen, also it takes a lot of language from the Community Economic Development Plans, CEDS, that the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has responsibility for developing for the region. So CEDS, similar to the estuary program, already has a set of goals defined for economic development. And we began to try to figure out how can we leverage those goals, but then also incorporate resiliency into them so there's a better buy-in and a linkage.
So the impacts here might include jobs, tax revenue, tourism, housing, and quality of life. Again, how those interact with the climate stressors and the natural hazards. And then we've developed some, draft goals. And because the goals are already written through the CEDS program, there are already actions underneath some of these goals. Do you want me to read through the goals, CJ?
Yeah, I think calling out the differences between, what some of these attempt to do and why we were honing in on these components. Again, there's a workshop for this chapter, so this is just initial copy to get some perspective from you all.
I'm not sure what you're asking for.
Oh yeah, no, yes, read. Sorry, that was my why is it good?
So the first goal is to improve the business post-disaster recovery capacity with a specific focus on local small businesses, disadvantaged businesses, and businesses within distressed and redeveloping communities. And there are 2 actions under there: preparing vulnerability assessments for flood scenarios and storm events, and then educating businesses on risks, continuity, and recovery plans. So the second goal, promote sustainable use of natural resources, especially water resources, habitats, green infrastructure, and green building design, and ensure that economic development activities are consistent with environmental management goals. So as compared to what was in the previous chapter, this is more supporting businesses in their use of green infrastructure and green building design. So the actions underneath that include conducting a climate vulnerability and economic impact study to assess projected changes to habitats and how that impacts tourism, hospitality, and recreation businesses. And then another action, develop partnerships and programs to encourage businesses to implement best practices regarding green infrastructure and natural environment restoration to support resilience. And here we might reference something in the place chapter if there's overlap there. And that's something that's always an option if there's goals that overlap and we want to reference how they overlap between the different chapters. So the third goal is support integration of resilience planning for cultural and historic assets. And the actions are to conduct a vulnerability assessment for the potential risks to cultural and historic assets. And then to maintain informational programs, update data, and prepare studies to update future information. So then goal 4, create strategic recruitment and incubator plans to support key business sectors, which will grow due to demand for resilience mitigation and sustainability improvements. So the action there is to collaborate with X to develop a report of emerging opportunities. So we would need to identify the collaboration there. And then goal 5, integrate resilience and economic development planning to consider vulnerabilities and new strategies for community redevelopment areas. We can add actions under there since they didn't have any written already. And same with any of the other goal sections. If there are additional actions that align with that goal, we can add actions under those goals as well. And then finally, promote regional perspective on multimodal transportation system for people, goods, services. That includes transit, highway, seaport, airport, rail, broadband, and multi-use trail planning and development. So again, these are goals from SEDS that might be harder to achieve, or we would have to sort of workshop that to make it something that's useful and actionable for our local government partners. Hank, I see your hand.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm here to contribute. There's a couple things. I see some goals like across the chapters, and I feel like they relate to each other. So this is more of a broader comment. You know, these little icons that we have, are we gonna have a way to like tag goals in different chapters that relate to each other so we can see which goals are interrelated? Cool.
Yeah,
All right.
yes, that was the plan.
All right, because I'm already thinking like, wait, this is similar to something we read earlier. There's that. I like to focus on the business community. You know, and I don't know how to say it, but I want to like straight up say that we're going to help more businesses remain in business after a disaster, right? So that whole, you know, 40% of businesses don't reopen after disaster. No, we're going to lower that, right? And so I don't know how to say that, but it would be cool if it was in there. I think this is a chapter where you can bring up sustainability and you know, in the business world, the word sustainability is pretty commonplace when it comes to finances and financial management, right? And so, you know, a sustainable business model, for instance, you know, I think that there could be a way to integrate that in here, and maybe dropping that in here and businesses seeing them as part of this can help with relation to other chapters. I also want, I don't know if it's in here or somewhere else, but when we're talking about businesses having the capacity to recover and reopen, we also need to help local governments do that too. Right? So, I mean, they need to have disaster reserve funds, you know, and have the capacity to, you know, rebound and reopen, so to speak. And so I don't know if that's here. That could be integrated within goal 1. I didn't really see it called out somewhere else. But I think that's a point of integration. And then goal 3, I think what's missing at the end of that sentence is preservation. So we're going to integrate resilience planning with cultural and historic asset preservation.
Got it.
That's it.
Thank you. That's excellent. Sheridan, you put a thing in the chat box about food systems. What's your thought on this?
Just from, I mean, I'm probably limited in my scope of living in Pinellas County, but like our food comes from either another county, another state, or another country. So, and we definitely, I think everyone experienced a little bit of like scare at the start of the pandemic with like realizing like how like vulnerable everyone's access to food is. Like, yes, absolutely, if you're food insecure, that's definitely like a concern. But also just like as our communities, as our cities and our counties, like, are we encouraging urban agriculture as a like resilient strategy?
So we could create maybe a multiple level, because food is a business, right? The whole food supply chain, from restaurants to retail to agriculture, the growth in different counties. So maybe we could introduce a broader food and agricultural set of resiliency goals or studies or initiatives to start to take stock of that. We've never even mapped the food deserts. Urban ag, some component of, I think feeding people ought to be a context, right? So, okay, thanks for bringing that up. Sorry, I got like dirt bikes going by me here. I don't know if you guys heard or not.
Tom Schofield, Pinellas County.
Tom, thank you for weighing in.
The previous slide, you mentioned tourism, but I don't really see any goal that kind of helps us with tourism in a regional sense. I think we found out with the pandemic just how vulnerable tourism is as a major part of our economy. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of a deeper dive through a goal would be a good idea for tourism as part of our economy.
So to understand its full impact on our economy, so we could better prepare for these vulnerabilities, or in like the pandemic and public health issues?
Well, just using that as an example, disaster events impact tourism tremendously. Mm-hmm. It's a service industry. Those jobs after a storm event, or obviously during a pandemic, those jobs are the first to go. And, is there a strategy we can adopt regionally that would help be resilient in the face of those sorts of events?
Those are good questions. What does anyone think about, I used to know some folks who worked at Visit Pinellas St. Pete. I tried to create an interesting grant back in the day with Visit Florida. And, my interaction with them, they were primarily like just worried about putting heads on beds and really focusing on the marketing and the attraction. Who would we start to engage if we wanted to discuss and think about tourism and resiliency? Who are the real leaders that we would
I think I would go to Visit St. Pete Clearwater, and I don't know if Hank's interacted with them at all, but I know as of like this spring, they had new leadership.
Oh.
And okay. So we were working with them on possibly co-funding an ecotourism like extension agent position, but I'm not in charge of that. And so I think it's kind of been back shelved with all, COVID and everything. And so I haven't interacted with the new leadership, but I would just try and go straight to the top and introduce yourself to that group. And
well, I'm not going anywhere. We as a region have to decide on these things, right? But so, Kevin, were you going to say
I could reach out. I mean, if you want me to.
Well, I think I'd
be happy to work on relationship building there.
Yeah, when we talk about this chapter, tourism and agriculture are two dominant industries of the region. And so I think, identifying how to better engage their business regional leaders is really a goal that we need to enhance here. There may be different levels of our leadership that can interact with them. Does anybody have any perspective on Hillsborough or the counties and cities regarding tourism? Manatee, you guys got a lot of tourism down there as well. You got a lot of agriculture. I don't know if Rob's still on or not. Oh, Sheridan's bringing up comments, prioritizing diversifying our economy so that we aren't dependent on tourism. Yes, that was a key thing, actually, that has come out of many different resiliency plans, is that, for example, Norfolk and other ones, recognizing where you're heavily dependent upon one. So that's where I think the goal number 4, which is to figure out what are the jobs of the future and how do we grow them in our region, and what that looks like in the context of resiliency and adaptation and energy, right? There's a whole set of probable, and I mean, like, I'm not saying, you know, become a developer of solar panels, but the issue is, what is it that we can do that set goals that are resiliency and sustainability related goals that will help incentivize or drive or create a favorable sort of culture and opportunity. I mean, I'm not saying pick winners and losers, but the idea is that you know, different groups we may need to look at this. So I think diversification is important. Any other good comments?
Kevin has his hand up.
Kevin.
This is completely different topic. Is that okay? Or
Yeah. Sorry, I saw you had your hand up. And
so I just had a question about the way these actions are written. They sound like regulatory requirements on a property owner, like conduct a climate vulnerability study and an economic impact study. Are we anticipating private sector to do these, or is the government going to do these for people?
Oh, that's a good question. I think these were intended that this would be the regional collaboration between a set of partners and entities to do this together.
Okay.
Not one group. So it may be like Tampa Bay Business Partnership and, you know, visit Pasco, visit Pinellas, visit blah as a collaborator, or we decide this is important and we need to get a grant to do this, to hire a bunch of specialists in tourism, destination management, and climate impacts, right? So, yeah, no, this is not, these are nothing that we have in here is intended to direct local individual business action. That's not what we want to do. So if it reads that way, thank you for bringing it up. We need to fix that stuff when we get to the actual language and voice. And Sean helped us.
Yeah, I think it goes back to Sean's, because another one, we conduct vulnerability assessment to define potential risks to historic assets. So if you're the owner of the Cuban Club in Ybor, you're required to do a vulnerability. That's the way you could read that.
Oh.
Well, yeah, and yes, exactly. I mean, if I was reading this as written, again, this is a regional document, so it says the region's going to do these things, you know, or TBRPC as the regional coordinator is going to do these things, because it is the region's document.
Okay, so we'll clarify. So, you know, do we as a region want to say you have the region do this, or is this a recommendation for local governments to incorporate their cultural and historic assets into their resiliency planning, right? You can see where one sounds like Big Brother and the other one is a good guidance that we could create a scorecard for, right?
Yeah, good guidance would be good as the goal for me.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I'd appreciate the good guidance language. You know, but it does help if, for example, we did a vulnerability assessment on historic assets in Hillsborough County and a commissioner said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I go, "Well, we thought it was important, and so did Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council."
Got it. All right. So
I'm gesturing a lot and I have my camera off. It's kind of weird.
Come on, turn it on. We got to see the emphasis. So
I'm talking like an Italian here.
Right. Okay. So there's a big couple of takeaways on this one. You're talking like an Italian. This is my family. So it's 3 o'clock. We want to be able to, you know, wrap this up for you guys. I think the takeaways on this is the clarity of who is to do what, right? So whenever the plan goals come out, the voice should clearly refine that the aspiration is the guidance for local governments to do potential actions, as separating it off from the region collectively will work on together, which may entail developing partnerships, obtaining funding, and that sort of thing. So remember, I think about this thing as like a 5-year action plan, right? So we'll build that stuff. So I think this was really good. We got one last screen, right? Any other comments on this? Okay. All right.
So next steps, we're going to send out links to get you to sign up for the first 2 workshops at least. Based on some comments we got at the session yesterday, we were previously proposing an October 23rd workshop. It looks like the 30th has more people available. So sending out a draft chapter before that meeting on the 30th to discuss chapter 1, which is, again, is the climate stressors and hazards. And then the chapter 2 is the date for that November 5th now?
Yeah, it's actually the 5th. The Florida Housing people weren't available on the 6th, and they're a key partner in that one. So
then we'll send out an email with a link to register for those, the same as you did for this meeting. And then again, meeting materials will go out before that. And if you think of somebody who should be at those meetings, who might have more of an interest in the hazard stuff, who's not here, please feel free to forward those meeting registrations to those staff members and colleagues.
right. And you guys have been tremendous in all the recommendations, ideas sharing through the chats, as well as those of you who participated verbally and vocally. Continue onward with this, and we really appreciate all that you are doing and all of the guidance that you give us to make this a useful document. This is really, really important to us, and we thank you for your positive comments and enthusiasm. We want to be able to, have a really good facilitated set of goals so we get to this. And we also at some point will need to really talk about how do we better engage our local elected officials. So the steering committee meeting for what was scheduled for October 12th has been canceled. We're hoping to get this, status update and better discussions on the November 9th steering committee meeting. But we want to make sure that we get input, and maybe it's best through you to get input. So figuring out how to work with you to collect and engage the local elected officials from the beginning, because that's really important, so that they, are things that are important to the groups that are not on our council and board members also have a way to get to us, right? So that's just a bigger perspective. So any last comments from y'all? There's so many good ideas come through.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. Thank you for hanging out on 2 hours of a Friday. Kara, thank you for keeping us organized and on track. We look forward to, so we're going to integrate comments from today, comments from yesterday, and then we'll see a sort of reflected list of recommendations for changes and improvements. And we'll start working through that as well. So any other pieces?
Great job. Good start.
Well, thank you for everyone's participation today. Any other ideas in terms of short-term resilience versus long-term? Also send that in, Steve. We welcome your expertise. All right, everyone, have a great Friday.